Little Orphan was sweeping the entire ranch. The owner came out and adopted her. It was just after dawn when Josiah Stone witnessed the impossible. In the vast, dusty expanse of his ranch yard, the orphan girl Abigail was wielding a tattered broom. She wasn't just sweeping the porch, she was trying to sweep the entire ranch. A silent, stubborn war against an acre of chaos. His first instinct was a cold annoyance, a fool's errand. But then he saw the fierce determination in her small frame, the methodical rhythm that defied the futility of her task. And he recognized it. It was the same war he'd been fighting for 5 years, a war against the memory of a fever that stole his wife and daughter. He saw his own silent, desperate battle reflected in her tiny, sweeping strokes. This quiet girl was a ghost he hadn't accounted for, a mirror held up to his own broken soul. The man they called Stone felt a dangerous crack form in his foundation. What happens when a man who buried his heart is forced to watch it beat again? And someone else. It was just after dawn when Josiah Stone witnessed the impossible. A ghost in a faded calico dress wielding a tattered broom against his kingdom of dust. Out in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the main yard, the orphan girl Abigail was sweeping. She wasn't just clearing the worn path to the porch. She was trying to sweep the entire ranch, an acre of stubborn Wyoming dirt that had not known order since the day the earth took his family. She moved with a silent, methodical fury, her small frame a stark punctuation mark in a paragraph of desolation. A fool's errand. The thought came cold and sharp as a winter wind. Annoyance tightened his gut, but he did not move. He just watched from the shadows of the porch, the tin cup of coffee growing cold in his hand. He saw the grim set of her small jaw, the relentless rhythm of her work. This wasn't a chore. This was a war. A war against the chaos that had swallowed her world whole, leaving her the sole survivor. He knew that war. He'd been fighting it for 5 years, a relentless, silent campaign waged with fence posts and ledgers against the invading force of memory. He'd tried to impose logic on the wild grief that bucked and kicked within his chest to build a fortress of labor where the ghosts of his wife Sarah and his daughter Lily could not trespass. He saw his own desperate, silent battle reflected in her tiny, futile strokes. The memory of the sheriff's wagon arriving a week prior surfaced unwelcome as a rattler in a bedroll. Sheriff Brody, a man whose face was a roadmap of other people's troubles, had stood at this very spot, hat in hand. "Josiah, I got no choice," Brody had said, his voice low. "She's the only one they found alive from that wagon train attack up on the pass. Comanche looked like. Hasn't said a word since. The women in town, they're spooked by her silence. Can you just keep her for a spell? Till the circuit judge comes through." Josiah had looked at the small, silent thing by the wagon wheel, a smudge of a girl with eyes that held the ancient emptiness of the plains. "This ain't an orphanage, Brody. I know it ain't. But it's a big place for a little girl to get lost in. She can earn her keep." Now, watching her fight the very dust of his land, Josiah felt a dangerous crack form in the foundation of the man they called Stone. He turned the screen door groaning shut behind him. "Girl." He barked, his voice a rusty hinge. Inside. Breakfast. The meal was a ritual of silence. The inside of his home was as barren as the land outside, scrubbed clean, every chair in its place, every dish put away. It wasn't a home. It was a tomb, and he was its tireless caretaker. Abigail ate the slab of cornbread he'd placed before her, breaking off small pieces and arranging the crumbs into a perfect straight line on her plate. Order. It was her only defense. The sight of it made his teeth ache. A shadow fell across the open doorway, and Josiah looked up, his hand instinctively resting near the colt at his hip. Bartholomew Thorne sat atop a magnificent black stallion, his tailored coat and polished boots an insult to the landscape. He dismounted with an easy grace, his smile as wide and shallow as a dry creek bed. Josiah Thorne said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "A lonely sight out here. Just you and the wind." His gaze flickered past Josiah, landing on Abigail, who had frozen in the corner like a startled fawn. Or maybe not just the wind anymore. Taking in strays now, your heart must be softening in your old age. What do you want? Thorne Josiah's voice was flat, hard as iron, just being neighborly. Thorne purred, walking onto the porch uninvited. He gestured vaguely at the vast, sun-bleached fields. "It's a lot of land for one man to handle, a lot of water to protect. A man needs a legacy. A partner, perhaps. something to build for the future. He was a vulture, circling, smelling the lingering scent of death on this place. "I'm managing just fine," Josiah said, his stance a silent warning. Thorne's smile tightened. "For now," he said, letting the words hang in the air. He tipped his hat. "You think on it, Stone. This land is too good to go to waste." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving a trail of dust and veiled threats. Josiah watched him go, then his eyes went back to the yard. Abigail was standing by the door, her tiny hand resting on the frame. She wasn't looking at the departing rider. She was looking at him, and in her eyes he saw not fear but a question he had no answer for. He was no longer just guarding a grave. He was now somehow guarding a life, and the wolves were circling. Thorne's dust settled, but his threat lingered in the air, thick and suffocating as a summer heat. Josiah turned from the door, his world suddenly smaller, sharper. He looked at the girl Abigail, her eyes wide and ancient, and saw not a child but a complication, a vulnerability. His armor, forged in the fires of grief, slammed back into place. "The woodpile needs stacking," he said, his voice a rasp of gravel. "The chickens need feed. The well won't draw itself. You wanted to earn your keep. Now is the time." He expected tears. He expected fear. He got neither. The girl simply gave a small, sharp nod, a soldier accepting orders, and slipped out the back door. Her obedience was a quiet rebellion, a refusal to be broken that chipped away at the stone of his resolve. Days bled into a routine of shared silence. He worked the fences. She managed the small world of the house and yard. She was a whisper in a house that had learned to scream silence, her presence a constant, unsettling hum beneath the surface of his solitude. One evening, as a chill wind swept down from the mountains, he saw her through the window, huddled on the porch steps, arms wrapped around her thin frame. The blanket he'd given her was little more than a rag. He grunted, annoyed at the unwelcome pang of something. Pity, responsibility. It didn't matter. A sick girl couldn't work. That was the lie he told himself as he climbed the ladder to the attic. The air upstairs was thick with the hallowed scent of dust and lavender, a shrine to a life that was no longer his. He opened a heavy cedar chest, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, nestled in yellowed linen, were Lily's things: a small dress, a wooden horse, and a thick, heavy wool blanket woven with stripes of faded blue. His heart a fist of stone clenched tighter. He snatched the blanket, slammed the lid shut, and descended, leaving the ghosts to their slumber. He left the blanket on her cot without a word. The next morning, he saw her by the corral, the blue wool wrapped around her shoulders like a royal cloak. She looked warmer, safer. The sight ignited a painful, treacherous warmth deep in his own chest. Was this what thawing felt like? It felt like burning. The next day, he found the fence. He was riding the north pasture along the artery of the creek that kept his land alive, the very water Thorne coveted. There, stretched between two posts, the wire was not broken. It was cut, cleanly. A deliberate act of sabotage, a Lobo move done in the dark. Rage, cold and clean, washed over him. At least a dozen head of cattle had wandered off, scattered into the unforgiving hills. The roundup was a back-breaking, sun-scorched hell. By the time he'd chased down the last stray, dusk was painting the sky in shades of bruised purple. He rode back to the ranch, bone-weary and simmering with a righteous fury. He expected to find the house dark, the girl hidden away. Instead, a lantern glowed in the open door of the tool shed. He dismounted, every muscle screaming, and peered inside. Order. She had brought order to his chaos. His tools, usually a tangled mess of rust and leather, were cleaned and hung in neat, perfect rows. The floor was swept. It was the work of hours. As he stood there stunned, he heard a soft sound from the calf pen. Abigail was inside, stroking the neck of a young calf that had been separated from its mother in the confusion. The animal, usually skittish and wild-eyed, was calm under her touch, its head resting against her small shoulder. She was humming a low, wordless tune that was heartbreakingly gentle. He saw her then, not as a burden or a ghost, but as a force of quiet strength. A healer. "That one's got a mean streak," he said, his voice startling them both. The girl looked up, her eyes reflecting the lantern light. She didn't flinch. She simply looked from him to the calf, and for the first time spoke a full sentence, her voice a fragile whisper. "He's just scared." The simple word struck him with the force of a physical blow. Before he could process it, his rancher's eye caught a dark matted patch on the calf's leg. "Hold him steady," he commanded, stepping into the pen. He knelt, pushing aside the fur. It wasn't a scrape from a rock or a tear from a thorn bush. It was a clean, vicious slice, deep enough to fester, shallow enough not to kill immediately. It was an act of pure cruelty. Thorn wasn't just trying to steal his land. He was poisoning it. He was torturing it. This was no longer a dispute between rivals. This was a war against a sickness, and its first victim was innocence itself. The discovery of the gash on the calf's leg changed the texture of the air. It was no longer a simple dispute over land and water. It was a war against a poison, and Josiah Stone had always been a man who met a threat head-on. He worked with a grim, focused silence, cleaning the wound while Abigail held the lantern, its light carving a small circle of order in the encroaching darkness. She did not flinch from the blood. She simply held the light steady, her presence a silent testament to a shared purpose. They were no longer just a man and a girl. They were a garrison of two holding a line against the coming night. In the days that followed, something shifted in Josiah. The chores he assigned Abigail became lessons. It started out of pure practicality. A ranch this size needed more than one pair of eyes. "You don't just look at the sky," he rasped one afternoon, pointing a calloused finger at the horizon. "You read it, those clouds high and thin like a mare's tail. They're liars. All show. But those ones, the dark ones that gather low on the plains like a brooding bull, they carry weight, they carry water, they carry..." He taught her the language of the land, the only one he was still fluent in. He showed her how to read the tracks of a coyote, how to find the North Star, how to listen to the creek, and know if the water was running high or low. She in turn began to quietly reclaim the house from its grief. One morning, a single defiant Indian paintbrush stood in a tin cup on the kitchen table. Its vibrant slash of red was an assault on the monochrome world Josiah had built. He stared at it, a cold knot tightening in his chest. It was the color of Lily's favorite ribbon. He wanted to throw it out. He left it where it was. Her voice, when it came, was still a fragile thing, but it grew stronger with each question. "Why does the wind have a name here?" she asked one evening as a mournful gust rattled the windows. Josiah, cleaning his rifle, paused. "Wind's just wind, girl." "No," she whispered, her gaze distant. "It sounds... lonely." He had no answer for that. How do you tell a child she is hearing the echoes of your own shattered heart? It was on a Sunday, a day that had lost all meaning for him, that Thorn returned. He found them on the porch, Josiah sharpening a knife, Abigail methodically braiding a horse's mane. The quiet domesticity of the scene seemed to fuel Thorn's venom. He dismounted his boots, silent in the dust. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "Saw you teaching the little stray how to read clouds." "Stone," Thorn began, his voice a low mocking drawl. Trying to replace what the fever took, Josiah's hands went still. The air crackled. "I remember your Lily Thorn," continued, his eyes glinting with a cold reptilian light. "A bright little thing, always chasing butterflies. A shame the Lord saw fit to thin the herd. Seems this land has a taste for your womenfolk." The world narrowed to the space between the two men. Josiah rose slowly, the knife still in his hand. He was a pillar of pure, murderous rage held in check by the thinnest thread of will. "Get..." He said the single word, a low, guttural promise of violence. "Off my land." Thorn just chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "There's that fire. A man with nothing left to lose is a dangerous thing. But a man trying to protect something new, he's just a fool." He tipped his hat and rode away, satisfied with the poison he had injected. Josiah slumped into his chair, the strength draining from him, leaving him trembling. The ghosts Thorn had summoned were screaming in his ears. He was back in that silent, fever-ridden room, holding a hand that was growing colder by the minute. He put his head in his hands, a ragged, broken sound escaping his throat. The fortress had been breached. The stone had crumbled. He waited for Abigail to run to flee from the sight of this broken man. Instead, he felt a small, hesitant touch on his arm. He looked up through a blur of unshed tears. She was standing beside him, her face devoid of fear. In her eyes was a profound, terrible understanding. She did not offer pity. She offered a shared truth. "The men who came..." She whispered, her voice barely audible. They took my mama and papa. I know the quiet that comes after. He stared at her, this child who had endured the unendurable. She wasn't a ghost of his past. She was a survivor just like him. She was not a reflection of what he had lost. She was a testament to what could still be found. In that moment, the fight changed. Thorn had not broken him. He had forged him into something new. The ghosts of his past were no longer chains holding him down. They were the reason to fight. And Bartholomew Thorn had just made the fatal mistake of threatening a man who had finally found someone to live for. The morning after Thorn's visit, the air in the small ranch house was different. The silence remained, but it was no longer the heavy, suffocating blanket of grief. It was the charged, humming quiet before a lightning strike. Josiah moved with a new purpose, his actions precise, his eyes holding a cold, clear light that Abigail had never seen before. The man of stone was still stone, but now he was the stone of a whetstone, sharpening himself for a coming conflict. He found her by the creek, the one place she seemed to be truly at peace, watching a small dipper bird dance on the rocks. "Sky looks clear," he said. The words felt foreign in his mouth, clumsy. It was the first time he had spoken to her about something other than a chore. She looked up, a flicker of surprise in her eyes, and gave a small nod. "The creek is singing today." She offered her voice soft as the water's murmur. He almost told her it was just the sound of water over rocks. But he stopped. He listened. And for the first time he heard it too. A fragile, hopeful music. A music Thorn meant to silence. That afternoon he knew something was wrong before he saw it. The music was gone. He was checking the water gate at the southern edge of his property, Abigail trailing a few paces behind, when he felt it, a wrongness in the earth, a faint tremor of thirst. The creek, their lifeblood, was weak, its voice a shallow, dying whisper. A cold dread, familiar and sharp, twisted in his gut. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice tight. He walked upstream, his boots sinking into the suddenly soft, muddy banks. The creek bed grew wider, emptier, the rocks exposed and gasping at the sky. He walked for nearly a mile, his dread mounting with every step until he found it. A scar. A brutal, ugly gash of fresh mud, felled timber, and piled rock choking the creek into submission. A crude dam built with the swift, arrogant cruelty that was Thorn's signature. His water was being stolen, diverted onto Thorn's already lush pastures, leaving his own land to wither and die. The rage that rose in him was not hot. It was a glacial force, immense and silent and utterly unstoppable. This was more than theft. It was murder. The slow, deliberate murder of his land, his legacy, his last sanctuary. He felt a small hand slip into his. Abigail had followed. She stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the ugly dam, and he felt her tremble. She knew what this meant. The end of the fragile peace she had found. He looked down at her, at the trust in her upturned face, and the glacier of his rage found its purpose. He was no longer just a man haunted by ghosts. He was a father protecting a future. He won't have it. Josiah said the words of vow spoken to the dying creek. He won't have any of it. He rode to the small neighboring homestead of Hector Vargas, an old ranch hand who had worked for Josiah's father. Hector was a man carved from the same tough, honest wood as the land itself, his loyalty as deep and steady as an underground spring. Josiah didn't waste words. Thorn damned the creek. Hector spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. His dark, weathered face was grim. Figured he'd pull something low. The man's all snake and no rattle. I'm tearing it down. Tonight, Josiah said, his voice flat. I'll need your gun. Hector looked at him, his gaze steady. He saw the new dangerous light in Josiah's eyes. He saw the ghost of the man Josiah used to be before the grief hollowed him out. He's got a dozen hired guns on his payroll, Josiah. We're just two men. We're two men who are in the right. Josiah countered. Hector was silent for a long moment. He looked out at the vast, indifferent landscape, then gave a slow nod. Get your rifle. I'll meet you at the fork, at sundown. As twilight bled across the sky, casting the world in shades of ash and fire, Josiah stood on the porch. Abigail watched him check his rifle, the metallic click of the chamber echoing in the quiet air. He was leaving. He was riding into a fight he might not ride back from. He couldn't bring himself to say goodbye. The words didn't exist for him. Instead, he knelt, so his eyes were level with hers. I need you to do something for me, he said, his voice rough. Keep the lantern lit in the west window. I'll need to see it when I get back. It was not a request. It was a promise. A beacon to guide him home through the darkness. She didn't speak. She simply reached out her small hand and pressed something into his palm. It was a smooth gray stone from the creek bed still cool from the water. A piece of the home he was riding out to save. He closed his fist around it, the stone a solid, real anchor in a world about to erupt in violence. He mounted his horse, Hector, waiting for him in the distance. He looked back one last time at the small girl standing in the doorway, a lone point of light against the growing darkness. Then he turned his horse and rode toward the night, a man with a stone in his hand and a war in his heart. The moon was a sliver of bone in the black velvet sky as Josiah and Hector tethered their horses in a grove of cottonwoods. Below them, nestled in the man-made scar on the land, Thorn's camp was a nest of arrogant firelight. They could hear the rough laughter of men who believed themselves kings, the clink of whiskey bottles. They were celebrating a victory that had not yet been won. Josiah felt the cool, smooth weight of the creekstone in his pocket. It was an anchor, a reminder of the small, steady light waiting for him back at the ranch. He was not here for revenge. He was here to reclaim a future. They moved like shadows, ghosts of righteous anger, until they stood at the edge of the firelight. Thorn Josiah's voice cut through the night, not a shout, but a low, carrying command that silenced the laughter in an instant. Bartholomew Thorn emerged from the largest tent, a half-empty bottle in his hand, a smug sneer on his face. Well, look what the cat dragged in, the ghost of Stone Creek Ranch. I knew you had some fight left in you, Josiah. I was counting on it. This is my water, Josiah said, his voice dangerously calm, his rifle held steady. Move your dam. Thorn laughed a sound that was all contempt and no humor. Your water, nothing is yours, Stone. The world belongs to the men strong enough to take it. You had your chance and you let it drown in grief. I own this valley now. He gestured to the dozen men now surrounding him, their hands on their holsters, and I have the manpower to prove it. The world held its breath. Then Thorn gave a slight nod. The night exploded. Muzzle flashes ripped holes in the darkness. Josiah and Hector dove for the cover of the rocks, the air filled with the shriek of ricocheting lead. It was a storm of fire and fury, a dozen guns against two. Hector grunted a bullet grazing his shoulder, pinning him down. Josiah was alone, the odds impossible, a cold certainty settling in his gut that this was the end of the line. And then from the ridge high above the dam, a new sound, a scraping, groaning protest of wood and rock. Thorn's men paused their eyes, darting nervously toward the towering wall of their own creation. A large boulder, dislodged from the cliffside, tumbled down, striking a key support beam with a sickening crack. It wasn't an act of God, it was an act of will. Josiah saw her then, a small, fleeting shadow against the moonlight. Abigail. She had followed them. The terror of that realization was a knife in his heart, but it was followed by a fierce, surging pride. She wasn't hiding. She was fighting. Using a long fallen branch as a lever, she was desperately trying to pry loose another rock, her small body straining with all its might. The dam groaned again, a deep guttural sound of a beast in its death throes. A jet of high-pressure water shot out from a new crack, hissing into the night. Panic erupted. The dam, one of Thorn's men, screamed. It's gonna go, Thorn, his face a mask of incandescent fury, saw the source of the chaos. He saw the small girl on the ridge, a defiant David against his Goliath. He raised his pistol, taking aim. No, a voice yelled. It was Grady, one of Thorn's own men, a young homesteader with a family of his own. He took a step forward. Not the girl, Thorn. We ain't murderers of children. Stay out of this. Thorn snarled, his eyes wild. That single moment of hesitation, that one crack in the wall of his authority was all Josiah needed. Fueled by a primal protective rage that burned brighter than any fire, he charged out from behind the rocks. He wasn't a rancher anymore. He was a father. He was a force of nature. He slammed into Thorn like a runaway locomotive. The pistol flew from Thorn's grasp. It was no longer a gunfight. It was a brawl, a desperate, brutal struggle in the mud and the spraying water of the failing dam. It was a fight for every ghost Thorn had mocked, for every moment of peace he had stolen, for the future of the small, brave girl on the hill. Josiah's fist connected with Thorn's jaw, the crack echoing the sound of the splintering dam. Thorn went down, his reign of terror ending not with a bang, but with a pathetic splash in the mud. At that moment, with a final deafening roar, the dam gave way. A tidal wave of liberated water, a torrent of life and justice, surged down the creek bed, sweeping away the wreckage of Thorn's ambition. His remaining men, terrified, scattered like rats into the night. Josiah stood chest-heaving, bruised and caked in mud, but victorious. The creek was singing again a thunderous, triumphant chorus. His gaze went to the ridge. Abigail was standing there safe. Her face, illuminated by the moon, was streaked with dirt and tears. Their eyes met across the churning water and the wreckage. It was an oath passed between them in the silent, chaotic dark. He had fought for her. She had fought for him. The battle was won. But as Josiah looked at the destruction at his wounded friend and at the fierce, silent child who had saved them all, he knew the war was far from over. He had drawn a line in the dust with blood and fire, and the world would have to reckon with it. The ride back was a long, slow procession through a world washed in the gray light of pre-dawn. The roar of the liberated creek had softened to a steady, contented murmur, a pulse of life returning to the thirsty land. Josiah rode with the unconscious form of Bartholomew Thorne slung over his own saddle, a grim trophy of a war he never wanted. Hector, his arm in a makeshift sling, rode beside him. But Josiah's gaze was fixed on the small figure riding Hector's horse, the blue wool blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders. Abigail. She watched the horizon, her face pale but resolute. They were a broken, battered army limping home from a victory that felt more like a brutal birth. When they reached the ranch, a posse was already there. Sheriff Brody at its head, his face a mask of grim concern. Josiah Brody said, his eyes taking in the scene, the wounded Hector, the captured Thorne, the exhausted girl. What in God's name happened out there? Josiah swung down from his horse, every muscle screaming in protest. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The exhaustion on his face, the blood on his knuckles, the quiet dignity of his stance, they spoke for him. He damned my creek, Brody Josiah said, his voice low and level. He was killing my land. He drew on me, and then he aimed his pistol at the girl. He said the last words with a cold, simple finality that left no room for doubt. It was not an accusation. It was a verdict. Brody looked at the snarling, defeated Thorne, then at the unwavering loyalty in Hector's eyes. Finally, his gaze settled on Abigail, who had slid off the horse and was now standing almost imperceptibly closer to Josiah. The sheriff saw the truth not in the conflicting stories that would surely be told, but in the silent, unshakable tableau before him. He saw a line that had been crossed and the man who had been forced to defend it. He sighed a long, weary sound. "I'll take him off your hands," Brody said, gesturing to his deputies. "We'll sort the legalities out, but you—" He looked at Josiah, then at Abigail. "You've got a home to put back together." In the 2 weeks that followed, the ranch began to heal. The water flowed clean and strong. The grass seemed to find a new, greener life. Thorne was gone, his power broken, his name a curse muttered in the town saloon. But the real change was inside the small, once silent house. The quiet remained, but it was a different species of silence. It was the comfortable quiet of two people learning the rhythms of a new life. It was in the way she knew to bring him a cup of coffee without being asked, and the way he knew to leave a piece of apple pie on the table for her. He found himself talking more, telling her the names of the constellations, the history of a particular branding iron stories of the land. He was rebuilding his world story by story, and she was his first and only citizen. He found himself thinking of Sarah and Lily not with the sharp, stabbing pain of an open wound, but with the gentle, bittersweet ache of a healed scar. He realized with a clarity that was both startling and peaceful that loving this new child didn't diminish his love for them. It was an extension of it, a continuation of the promise to protect and to cherish. The circuit judge arrived on a sweltering Tuesday, a stern, tired man who'd seen every kind of trouble the West had to offer. He sat on their porch, the official papers on his lap, looking flimsy in the vast landscape. "You understand what this means?" Mr. Stone, the judge, asked, peering at him over his spectacles. "She becomes your legal responsibility, your kin. In the eyes of the law, she will be your daughter." Josiah didn't look at the judge. He looked at Abigail, who stood beside his chair, her hand resting on its wooden arm. She was wearing a new dress sewn by one of the women in town, a peace offering. A wild flower was tucked behind her ear. I'm not trying to replace what I lost. Your Honor, Josiah said, his voice rough with an emotion he no longer fought. The words were hard forged in the deepest part of his soul. I'm building what comes next. He looked at Abigail, at her brave, trusting face, and he finally said the word that made it all real. She is my daughter. The judge stamped the papers. The law had finally caught up with the truth of their hearts. Later, as the first true dawn of their new life broke across the plains, they stood on the porch together. The world was washed in gold and rose clean and new. I have something for you, Josiah said. He held out his hands. Lying in his calloused palms was the tattered calico doll she'd had when she arrived, but it was no longer tattered. He had painstakingly stitched its torn seams, replaced its button eyes, and fashioned new yarn for its hair. He had mended what was broken. She took the doll, her small fingers tracing the clumsy stitches. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with a light that outshone the rising sun. "Thank you," she whispered. And then so softly he almost thought he'd imagined it, she added, "Papa." He put his hand on her shoulder, a gesture that was now as natural as breathing. Together they watched the sun climb higher, two survivors, a father and a daughter, their faces turned toward the light. The ghosts were finally quiet. The creek was singing. And on a small ranch at the edge of the world, a home was born.